So this video is all about adding with negative integers, and we're going to start by focusing on integers as a way of starting to talk about addition with negative numbers and how it works. And then eventually, later on in the year, we're going to extend into decimals and fractions and things like that, so we talk about the complete set of things that we can do when it comes to adding negative numbers. But in order to understand the process and to really start that foundation building, we're going to start with negative integers. And in order to talk about adding with negative integers, we have to go to a very basic fundamental question, which is, what does addition actually represent? What does it really mean when we talk about something like 25 plus 14? So go ahead, pause the video, take a few seconds up to a minute to jot down some thoughts that you have, and unpause when you're ready to move on. So there are usually two things that come to mind when we talk about addition. The first, which is the way that we've talked about addition all the way from when you first learned it, when you were in kindergarten or first grade, is the grouping together of objects into larger and larger groups. If you have 2 or 3 piles of apples and you put them together, you're going to add the number of apples in each pile to get the total number of apples that there are. For positive numbers, and in particular for positive integers, that strategy works great because we are able to see the accumulation of things and understand them as adding in positive numbers. But as soon as we start to add in negative numbers, or really as soon as we start to add in fractions and decimals, it becomes more difficult to envision it like this. And with negatives, it becomes impossible. So we have to look at addition with the other meaning that addition has, which is leaps on a number line. And you may have never heard about it this way before, but if we envision number lines and we activate what we've known before, what we've learned before about negative numbers, including the direction of negative numbers and absolute values, we'll be able to come up with the rules for adding negative numbers that are we're going to be able to use in all the rest of the addition that we do throughout the year. And so when it comes to leaps on a number line, we have positive numbers to the right, we have negative numbers to the left, and part of the question becomes, how do we know which direction to leap? And that comes back to the idea of directed numbers, where we talked about how -7 can be talked about as a drop of 7 degrees. It can be a loss of $7. Things like positive 125 could be climbing 125 feet, gaining 125 points in a game or in a class for work that you do, gaining $125, things like that. And another way that we can look at figuring out which direction it is and why direction is important, to think about addition as travel away from a place on a map. So if we start in New York and we say that north is positive and south is negative, well then if we're directing our travel north, we can drive maybe up 95, we get to New Haven. That's the positive direction of travel. And if we're going to say we're going to travel the 60 or 70 miles that it is from New York to New Haven, I think it's maybe even longer than that, then we need to know that we're going in that direction. But if we're traveling that same 100 miles down in the other direction, well then we're getting close to Philadelphia. Or maybe not quite Philadelphia, Trenton may be a better idea there. But still, the idea that we're just traveling 100 miles isn't as significant unless we know what direction we're traveling. And the same thing is true about leaps on a number line. We have to know which direction we're leaping. And so when we're talking about addition, there are 2 major things that we're after when it comes to the sum. The first is we want to know how far away from 0 we are, and that's going to come from absolute values. And we're going to use absolute values as a part of our addition rules. And the second thing is we want to know if the sum is positive or negative. Not all sums will be positive, not all sums will be negative. Sums could be 0 depending on what you're adding together, but these are the 2 big things that we have to talk about. How far from 0 are we, and is the sum positive or negative? Pause the video, write down these 2 guiding questions, because these are going to be the big things that we try to figure out, and then come back when you're ready to look at addition itself. So let's start with something that's familiar, and that's going to be adding with positive numbers. And to add positive numbers as leaps on a number line, we're going to use these blue arrows on the screen here. And if what we want to do is talk about, for example, 15 plus 20, well then we view a positive number as 15 plus 20. And we can use that as 2 leaps away from 0, a leap of 15 or a leap of 20. And a leap of 20 rather. The other way we can look at addition in the positive sense is to start at a number, and let's say we're going to take 5 plus 40. Get these other arrows out of here. If we say 5 plus 40, then we're going to start at the number 5, and we're going to leap 40 in the positive direction. And that's what we're talking about with leaps on a number line with positive numbers. Here's 5, and there's the leap of 40. So therefore, 5 with an additional 40 in the positive direction, as we know, is 45. Now, if we think of negatives the same way, and negatives are numbers that are directed in the more negative direction, which seems pretty self-evident, but it's important to say, then we can look at it the same way. If we start, for example, with something like negative 15 plus negative 20, well, then we leap 15 from 0 backwards on the number line, and we leap 20 again backwards on the number line. And so when we're thinking about how far are we from 0, if we're adding two negative numbers, we're just continuing to go farther and farther and farther in the negative direction, and we're never going back towards 0. So therefore, our absolute value of our sum, that distance from 0, is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So if we're adding two negative numbers, let's try one more example here. And we'll say negative 10 plus negative 25. Well, if we start at negative 10 and then move 25 in the negative direction, we're going to end up a total distance of 10 plus 25, or 35 away from 0 in the number line, except in the negative direction. And so much like positive integers, when we're adding positive numbers, we're adding their absolute values together because we're getting farther and farther from 0. The same thing is true with negative numbers. And so the rule when you're adding numbers with the same sign, two negatives or two positives, is we just add their absolute values together because their distance from 0 is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Positive numbers move in the positive direction, negative numbers move in the negative direction, and we end up with a sum whose absolute value, is larger, greater than any of the addends. So go ahead, pause the video, write this down, and then we'll look at two example problems to show what that means. So if we're looking at some examples here, let's take one with all positives and one with all negatives, 17 plus 83 and negative 24 plus negative 47. We know from experience that this is just going to be 100 because we take 17 plus 83. Here we have two negative numbers. They're both moving in the negative direction on the number line, so their total distance from 0 is going to be the sum of the two, which is 71, but because we're moving to the left all the time, the sum there is negative 71. Now when we have mixed signs, positives and negatives, it gets a little more complicated because if we're moving, for example, 30 in the positive direction, but then we add negative 15, which moves backwards on the number line compared to a positive number, we're not going to be a distance of 45 away from 0. Some of those movements and those numbers are going to be in this area here where we sort of undone that movement. We've started at 30 and moved 15 backwards. And if we started at, for example, 40, and we wanted to move 20 backwards, which we'll show on the bottom of the number line here, then we're making up some of that distance, and we're moving closer to 0 because the positive number wants to move in the positive direction. The negative number wants to move in the negative direction. And so we're not getting farther away from 0. We're actually sort of retracing our steps in a way. And that's going to be the idea of how we add numbers with mixed signs. That's we subtract their absolute values because instead of getting farther from 0, they're staying close because one wants to move left and one wants to move right. So go ahead, pause the video, write this down, including the idea that the sum has the same sign as the addend with a larger absolute value. We'll talk about that in just a second. But pause the video, write this down, and come back when you're ready to move on. So as two example problems, let's take 17 plus negative 83. So if we're going to start, we can envision this as starting at negative 83 and moving back 17 towards 0 on the number line, which means that our distance from 0 has actually gotten smaller because we've gone back towards it. And starting with a greater value and moving in the direction of the lesser value, or the lesser absolute value rather, is a good way to think about it. So we're not quite 83 away from 0 anymore. We are instead only 66 steps away from 0, but we're still in the negative direction because 83 steps negative is still greater than 17 steps positive. So that sum is negative 66. On the second question here, negative 24 plus 47, at 47 on the number line, and moving backwards by 24, which takes us closer to 0, and we end up, instead of 47 steps away from 0, or 47 units away from 0, we end up instead 23 units in the positive direction away from 0, because we've taken 47 steps in the positive direction and only 24 back in the negative. So our overall sum is going to be positive. So go ahead, pause the video, work on these 4 problems, and then come back when you are ready to see their answers and move on, remembering that if they have the same sign, we get farther from 0, so we add their absolute values. If they have different signs, we stay closer to 0, or move closer to 0, so we subtract their absolute values. Well, in the first problem up here, negative 37 plus 42, if we imagine it as starting at 42 on a number line and moving backwards by 37, not quite all the way to 0, we can see that we have to subtract the values. To get that, 42 minus 37 is 5, and we're still positive because 42 has a greater absolute value than 37. Moving over to the right, negative 24 plus negative 47, that is 2 numbers, both moving in the negative direction on the number line, so the overall distance from 0 is going to be the sum of those 2, which is 71, and we're moving in the negative direction, so it's negative 71. In the bottom left is a familiar problem. 75 plus 25 is 100. We know that because it's 2 positive numbers, and we're moving farther away from 0 in the positive direction. And negative 75 plus 25, we're starting on the number line at negative 75, and we're getting closer to 0 by taking a leap of 25 back in the positive direction. We still haven't crossed 0 because 25 has a lesser absolute value than 75, but instead of being 75 units away from 0, now we are 50 because 75 minus 25 is 50, but we end at negative 50. So as a quick review, when you add numbers with the same sign, you add their absolute values because we're getting farther and farther from 0. When you add numbers with mixed signs or unlike signs, you subtract their absolute values because instead of getting farther from 0, we're actually moving closer to 0 when we start at the larger absolute value and then add the smaller.